Hi. Nice to see you. Look, guess what we've been doing?
And I think that's just about it. If there's anybody here who didn't get a copy of the report, do try and grab me at the end and we'll try and sort that out. We were absolutely blown away by the numbers of people booking on. So we have pretty much a full house today, which is why you're all gathered quite cosily in this wonderful old lecture theatre, and a few of you might need to sort of squeeze up to accommodate the latecomers up there. So I will crack on without further ado. I can't quite remember, was it about a year ago? A group of us from the early years sector found ourselves getting together and saying, these proposed reforms to the EYFS, is the sector getting heard? And I think there was a real feeling that the sector wanted to be more actively involved. They wanted to see a process that mirrored the Tickell review, where there was engagement with the sector, there was co-production, and there was a really firm rooting of any changes in the research base. And so that was the aim. We brought together membership bodies from across the early years to do that. And we commissioned a literature review, which is what we're delighted to be launching tonight, and you'll hear the details from Chris in a minute. We commissioned a survey of practitioners, and you have in your little A4 sheet got a sort of little hint of the findings of that, but we had such a fantastic response, 3,000 respondents, that we are still sifting through the detail of that, and there will be a much fuller report in due course. We've been trying to make sure that we maintain dialogue with DFE officials, and we're delighted to have with us tonight Susie and Henna from the department. Very glad that they can join us to hear your views, and tonight it's very much about your views as well as all the information that we've collected. And we have and we will continue to campaign about these changes and make sure that people are aware, and hopefully, particularly as we go through the formal consultation, but actually quite crucially before that, we want people to be aware and engaged, and making sure that this set of changes to the EYFS make it better in as many ways as possible. So, without further ado, do come in, find a space. I think there probably are a few if people can sort of squeeze up and let our last few latecomers in. I shall hand over to our first speaker. We were delighted when Chris Pascal and Tony Bertram and colleagues at CREC agreed to take on this literature review for us. They'd done similar exercises in the past. They had a vast database of literature, and we wanted them to analyse it with respect to our very specific questions about taking forward the EYFS in the best possible way. So I'm delighted to hand over to Chris to talk you through what they found.
Well, good evening, everyone. And I guess you've had a busy day like me, and here we are in this wonderful lecture theatre to further our professional development even more. But also to get a sense of where we are evidentially around the early years foundation stage, and to think a little bit more critically and in an informed way about the evidence base we have as things move forward and as we start to look at the existing foundation stage curriculum framework and propose changes and developments to it. As Beatrice said, this was a very short, sharp piece of work that CREC undertook, the Centre for Research in Early Childhood. And I'm going to lead the presentation, but of course there were other people involved in it. My colleague Tony Bertram, who's here somewhere in the room, and another of our postdoc students, Dr. Elizabeth Rouse, who helped us with this work. And it was an intensive piece of work, and I'm not going to even attempt to try and summarise everything that's in this thick-ish report. There's a lot of evidence there. What I'm going to do is try and bring some headline findings from that to get us to kind of think about your positionality in relation to the early years foundation stage. And you'll be aware that curriculum and pedagogy for young children is a very contested space in discourse. It's a very politicised space because it is about power and place and positionality and where you stand and who's got the power to kind of shape what those early experiences are going to be of our youngest children. And I and my colleagues at CREC were very, very clear about the potential impact of a document such as we were trying to put together. But we've tried to keep it very evidence-based, very scholarly and very academic in that it's really looked hard and in a critical way about the existing knowledge base we have. And it's up to you guys really to do the politics with it, to decide how you're going to use this evidence to create your voice and speak on behalf as advocates of those young children and particularly those vulnerable children as politicians and as policymakers shape the space in which you operate and, more importantly, young children operate and what the expectations around that. And the title is Getting It Right. And I'm a bit kind of contested myself about the title because how do we get it right? What does right mean? Right is a value judgment, what's right and what's wrong. And it's very culturally located as well. But you've got to think about for you and the spaces and places that you operate in and the debates and the dialogues you have about how we get it as best as we can, really, respecting that other people have different views or contested views. And some of the work we're trying to do at CREC and in ECERA is to try to say there's not a right or wrong in any of this. It's perspective-led, really, and positionality-led. And we've got to get better. And the whole Brexit debate, which I hate to bring up here, but it's all about us and them, me and you. It's contested, it's adversarial. And part of what we're trying to do is saying, let's get back to a more consensual way of operating, a more respectful way of having dialogues about human beings and how we move forward in a moral and ethical way around that, respectful of difference and dialogue. So I want to set it in that sense. We've got to get better at listening to each other, respecting each other, but also not being afraid to have our voice as well, and our ethical position to speak on behalf of children and families that maybe have a less of a voice than we do. So I'm going to present the headline findings and give you some provocations to think about. Do you need to act on these findings? What actions will you take on these findings? What are you going to fight for? What are you going to advocate for? Really explain where you feel the direction of travel should be. The questions that we set ourselves, and it was a coalition that set CREC these questions to look at the evidence base about how we identified the literature and the evidence that we looked at and we're presenting in this report, and then key findings and action points. And then from that, the coalition of organisations that you saw on that front slide and that is on the front of here, the coalition have used those findings to make some recommendations. And it's up to you to look at those recommendations, think what are you going to do with them? How are you going to use those in a positive developmental way? So you'll know that the Early Years Foundation stage sets those national standards for learning, development and care for children from birth to 5 years old. And I say again, I came out of the classroom. I was a reception class teacher for many years. Reception class is foundation stage. Okay, so we encompass that. And it was last reviewed in 2011 by the Tikel panel, of which I sat on, who looked at a big part of that was looking at the evidence to try and put that framework together. And Maria Evangelou and her colleagues at that time did it was 2009, I think, her review. And she did a deep dive into the evidence to try and inform Dame Claire Tikel and the panel about how this framework should sit and what it should contain. And we know that we're now looking again. It was reviewed then in 2012, we had a revised framework, but now it's being looked at again. And we felt, the coalition felt, that we should look again at the evidence, because 10 years in the world of research, many of you in this room are researchers and practitioners who are informed by research. We know that practice and research hasn't stood still. So we thought we should look again. 10 years is a long time to look at what else has come out and been published since Maria Evangelou did that first deep dive into the evidence. So that's what we were set to do, to have a look at the evidence base, to inform the coalition who were interacting at government level to try and inform government and policymakers as they looked at the review of the EYFS. There were two broad overarching questions that coalition group, that research group, set CREC, or set us to do. The first one, the overarching one, was the Tickell review created the prime subjects and the, what were the second one? Yeah, those. So there were three areas of learning that were more important, fundamentally more important, were more time sensitive and kind of underpinned all the other areas. It wasn't you do that and you don't do the others, but it was that those things were vitally important to put into place because they underpinned everything else. And there was a rationale for these prime and specific areas. And alongside that, and I'm looking at Helen here, and her colleagues, who really campaigned about these characteristics of effective learning and teaching, but it was effective learning back then, that really underpin those as well. But they weren't seen as an area of learning. They were kind of seen as advisory in a way to think about pedagogy as much as anything. So we wanted to look at that framework to say, does the current evidence still hold the rationale? Dame Claire Tickell had a very clear rationale about why those areas of learning were more important. And yet some of the pressures were to kind of shift that a little bit, particularly the contestation. If you think of contested spaces around literacy and numeracy as being specific areas rather than prime areas. What does the evidence say about those? Does it still hold up? And so that was one big question that we were asked to look at, the evidence base around that rationale. And then looking at all those areas of learning, what aspects have been affirmed as being critically important, and not just in terms of content of teaching, but also the pedagogy that supports those areas of learning and the content there. And was there evidence to say things needed to be shifted or tweaked or changed a little bit? What adjustments needed to be made? Because we were also open to the fact that, you know, it wasn't perfect. We had to kind of be open to new evidence coming in to help us think a little bit more in an informed way. So what aspects were affirmed? Yeah, keep going with that. That's working. That's really strong. But what could do with adjusting a little bit? So those were the overarching question, and there were 6 or 7 other kind of sub-questions under that, which I won't go into. We looked at evidence on summer-born children, we looked at particular pedagogic approaches, we looked at particular curriculum areas. And we looked also at approaches for less advantaged or underachieving children as well. So there were kind of sub-questions under that, but those were the broad review questions. We used an approach to the literature, which is called rapid evidence assessment. We had a short period of time to do this in, like weeks. It was really short and sharp, and very, very limited resources. We were very grateful to the Froebel Trust and the Montessori charity that helped fund this, but it was a very contained piece of work. So we use rapid evidence assessment. It's a very well tried and tested methodology for looking at review, but it is short and sharp. It can't cover everything because of the nature of it. So that the methodology around that is to put very clear parameters around your literature review and research. We decided that we would look primarily, there'd been a number of research reviews, which are very helpful. And actually, CREC had done a couple of those ourselves. So we'd already got quite a lot of evidence that we'd scrutinised and looked at and written about. So we could build on that, but there were other reviews that you'll see in the report that we drew on. And we also decided we would only look at papers that had been subject to peer review in academically reviewed journals. So that was another screening out process. So they had to meet a certain level of methodology and academic standards. And we would only look at work that had been published between 2009 and 2019. We contained it in that kind of way. In addition to that, we consulted with quite a wide range of other early years organisations in the sector who specialists in maths or literacy or language or arts or science, and asked them if there was particular pieces of research that we should really take a look at that had been published in these times, and we did that as well. So we got their feedback as well, and they looked at what we analysed in order to kind of do a kind of checking of it. And then all those studies, and even that narrowing down, led to hundreds of documents and hundreds of pieces of research. And we categorised those according to 8 criteria on quality and relevance, and screened out stuff. And then we prioritised just those that scored the highest. Can you see that? So we narrowed it down. So what's presented in this report is evidence that meets the highest level of scholarship and academic standards. You might agree or not agree with that, but that's the methodology that we used. Okay, so I'm going to move quickly on to the key overarching findings. And the first and major finding we had, that there is the evidence that we've looked at and presented in this report says there is no substantiated case for the current early years foundation stage statutory framework to be significantly changed. It's working very well. It's sitting well within what we know works and is effective pedagogically and curriculum content-wise for these children from birth to 5. It sits within that. If anything, the evidence that's come out in the last 10 years reinforces that framework and the case that it's made. So it strengthens the case for that rather than detracts from it. And that really is the headline finding. You know, don't tinker with what's working, basically. It's working pretty well. However, it's not perfect, and we're open to thinking of how we might improve it. And we also know that less advantaged children are continuing to underachieve using that framework. And we were asking the question, why? And we looked at evidence about why these less advantaged children, less successful children, and why this gap in attainment is perpetuated, particularly as they progress into primary schooling, because we have this kind of rather abrupt transition between the early years foundation stage and year 1 of the national curriculum. And it's at that point in key stage 1 where a lot of these children coming from less advantaged backgrounds really struggle. So we wanted to look particularly at that. And so from the evidence, we revealed that we believe that with some modifications, and you can see the headlines here, that we could make it work a little bit better for that group of children. And the headlines are that there is more work to do and more thinking to do around communication and language development. And there is more work to do around the characteristics of effective teaching and learning, and we're broadening it out to say teaching and learning now. There's more work to do there if we're going to get it right for these less achieving groups of children. So those are the kind of headline findings. I'm now going to go into a little bit more detail with 10 kind of overarching action points to be provocative to you, to think about what you might do and how you might use the evidence in this report to think about that. Before I do that, I wanted just to say there were some gaps. When we looked at the evidence over the last 10 years, some of these areas had lots and lots and lots of current, relevant, recent research. But other areas, there were quite big gaps in research. People are not researching. For those of you in the room that are interested in research, there's more research that needs to be done. And there was a lot of research on, interestingly, literacy and communication and language. Quite a lot of research on that. There's quite a whole developing cadre of research on maths. And there's quite a lot of research developing on personal, social, emotional development and developing around self-regulation, executive functioning. It's developing there. But there is a real lack of really robust research on arts and creativity. Very, very little we could find published in high-quality academic peer-reviewed journals on technology, the use of technology and digital technology, and understanding of the world. Those two broad areas of learning and development are under-researched. There's a lot of professional writing about them, but that's different to academic scholarly research. So that tells us that there's a gap there that we've got to really get to. So we couldn't really, in this evidence review, say a lot about that other than we need more research about it. We know those two areas, by the way, underpin a whole lot of other areas, don't we? But we haven't got the evidence there in scholarly journals to be able to kind of definitively say what that is. Okay, so here's the action points. The report, I think, can make a case to say that the current statutory framework could be modified to give greater prominence to the characteristics of effective teaching and learning, which really foreground things like creativity, active learning, problem solving, persistence, self-regulation maybe. Okay, there's those characteristics of effective teaching and learning. They're kind of threaded through personal, social, and emotional development, as well as the characteristics of effective learning. But those need sorting out more carefully. And some of the current thinking around self-regulation needs a better look at. Some of the terminology is a bit flawed in how it's interpreted. We use the terms executive functioning and self-regulation, like interchangeably. So there needs to be greater clarity on that. But also, how and where does that sit within the early years foundation stage framework? It kind of straddles a lot of different areas, particularly personal, social, emotional, but also the characteristics of effective learning and teaching. But it kind of isn't clear in either of those what the line is on that. And yet we know from the evidence that if anything, those are the things that secure lifelong learning, that secure a child's ability to take advantage of their learning as they progress, not just in the foundation stage, but throughout their life. I'm not even just talking about their schooling system. And we know that if those things aren't securely in place before more formalised teaching, that a child is in real trouble, you know. And it is things like emotional well-being. It is things like the child's ability to self-regulate, the child's ability to create and work alongside other children, the child's ability to persist and keep going and to be resilient. These kinds of things, they are learned habits of mind and action. And if they're learned, how do we teach them? How do we give children the opportunity to experience those areas of learning? There's a lot of work for us to do around that. But we know that actually, if we do nothing else in the foundation stage, if we give children that secure grounding in those habits of learning, in their ability to be a learner, they've got something that's there with them for life. And it's not just kind of an assumption like the old EYFS, the current EYFS kind of just assumes those characteristics are there. It encourages us to encourage them in children, but they're not part of the statutory framework, actually. So I think we need to kind of really think about that. It's a major thing that's there. As in international work, a lot of the international evidence is adding evidence to how important those are in children's lifelong success. So links to action point 2. So the question for you guys is, what do we do about that? How do we sustain those areas? Now, the current EYFS framework highlights PSED as a prime area of learning. That, as a prime area of learning, is supported. We know that a child that's sociable, a child that's got social cognition, a child that is emotionally able to manage and self-regulate. We know that a child who's got those attitudes and dispositions to self-manage, be resilient, self-organise, we know that that's all there in the PSED. But we feel that area could be one that's extended to cover this wider range of things with greater clarity about what we mean by self-regulation, which is become a kind of catchphrase without very clear understanding of what that really means. It's complex. Action point 3, and I'm coming on to communication and language. The evidence is absolutely unequivocal that children need to have a confident grasp of oral language and communication before they're moved on to grasp the skills of written forms of language. Now, I'm not into they've got to do this before they do that. Course literacy and early literacy needs to go on at the same time. But it's founded and based on a secure understanding of how oral language works, and oral language, how that works in context, in the real world, in everyday interactions and language there. This is where you get the overlapping of the holistic view. We know that play and the imaginative play, and interestingly, and we know expressive language is much more stimulated in the outdoors. That's interesting, isn't it? That children use a wider range of vocabulary because they've got to describe a wider range of impressions and stimulations when they're outdoors. So you see how it's linked to pedagogy and practice. So they need a wide range of oral language and communication. And the evidence is really clear. Where children are still working at oral language and communication, particularly where their first language is not English, they need to have more and more practice of talk and language, enriched language experiences and communication opportunities, and outdoors and expressive language. And I would argue that if they are not secure, so say they're coming from a language where English is not their first language, that needs to extend up into Key Stage 1. So that real importance of oral language and communication into Key Stage 1, Year 1 and Year 2, and imaginative play and outdoors experience needs to be there to give these children the chance to extend their repertoire and their vocabulary. And I make the point that communication is not just spoken language. We communicate in many, many different ways, emotionally as well as verbally. Okay, I'm moving on to mathematics now. And the research around mathematics, again, very interesting, and a lot more people doing and developing research in this area now. But again, it's saying that before we move on to kind of concrete mathematical and numerical understandings, children have to understand the concepts that we're dealing with, and practically rehearse the communication and language. In mathematics is a set of symbols. Symbols are another form of language. So you've got to really understand what those symbols represent, and there's concepts that underpin those symbols. So again, it's understanding those mathematical concepts like equivalence, and more than, and less than, in real-world situations before they get onto paper and the written symbolic codes of what mathematics is. And I put this one in. There is no evidence, because I think this is a key thing that many of us are kind of shouting about, that shape, space and measure and technology is kind of disappearing. And there's no evidence to say that, in fact, the evidence is saying an understanding of that is as important as understanding number, okay? In terms of understanding the long term and applying that in terms of science and technology and their understanding of the world. Okay, so again, look at that mathematics evidence very clearly there. Oops. Okay, I'm going to now talk a little bit about teaching and learning approach, but again, it's really important not to be adversarial, formal teaching against free initiative and play. We know from a lot of the evidence that a kind of balanced approach, which incorporates absolutely play-based, child-led, child-initiated activities alongside more structured learning and teaching, needs to be recognised more fully. And particularly where the children are in transition between EYFS and Key Stage 1. Because it tends to be secure with the younger children in the early stages of the foundation stage, but it is under threat as they move towards reception and then into year 1. And remember what I said about children who need that experience with language, which we know and is enriched through imaginative play-based child-led activities and lots of dialogue. So we've got to really think about what does that balanced approach mean. And again, it's not about no formal or structured or adult-led activity. It's the balance in that. But primarily the balance we would hope would be shifted towards giving children agency and autonomy and having a right to shape their days and shape the direction of their learning. And I also want to point to the work of people that are really showing the importance of relational approaches. Pedagogy comes down to a relationship between those who lead the learning and those who are learning. You know, teaching and learning is a relationship. And that relationship is based on emotion, actually, and feelings, and connectivity, and attachment, and care. So again, the evidence about relational pedagogies and working at those relationships rather than a transmissive, I'm the expert and you're the... And this view around power being in learning, being distributed between the learner and the teacher. And by the way, other children can be teachers too. So that all the time the child is in an ongoing dialogue with another, where they're sometimes learning and sometimes teaching, sometimes leading, sometimes following. And how that is, you're into learning mode, and it's not like that. It's reciprocated and fluid. And those kinds of, and I would use the word affection, where the teacher has a stake and an emotional attachment to the learner. And I don't mean that in a soppy, bless them, love them, you know, aren't they lovely kind of way. That can be oppressive, by the way. That can be just as bad. But I mean that you have a stance of care and I use the word affection, you know, that you work with that child in a positive kind of way. You know what I'm talking about, don't you? Okay? So that relational bit, we sometimes lose that. We think we've got to have curriculum content and a plan and a structure and a learning outcome and a lesson plan, and it isn't about that, actually. It's a much more relational, fluid relationship that goes on, and the evidence is saying those teachers that work in that kind of way get better results. Okay, I talked earlier about the gap of knowledge. We know that understanding the world is we need to know more about how we introduce children to that wider view of the world and the diversity in that. And in England, we have a very poor sense generally about children's rights and children's rights from the beginning for very young children. If you go to the Scandinavian countries, their whole curriculum is based on children's rights and democracy and citizenship. And we kind of think that because they're not talking, we can't give them that sense. But actually, young children are very good at asserting their rights. But we need more work on that, about rights-based pedagogies and what citizenship means. And I particularly in today's world, where I think democracies are really fragile. Where do children learn citizenship, voice, the ability to stand up for themselves, to fight their corner, to express their needs? They learn it really early on. And often, and remember Peter Moss and Gunilla Darberg, early child centres are the places of democratic encounter, the first places the child gets the sense of that. We don't talk enough about that bit of learning and citizenship. And we also need to look again at science and the digital age. It's a research gap. Creativity is another research gap. I know Beatrice is telling me I've got to finish quickly. Expressive arts is a research gap, but interesting, and that underpins many other areas of learning. Again, the evidence we've got. We looked at the evidence around less advantaged children, children who are struggling. The evidence is they need more and enriched of the same for longer. Okay, more enriched and the same for longer. They need more opportunity to develop their wider learning dispositions. So don't give them another diet. Don't think you've got to switch them to more formal, structured, didactic motions to get them through. They need the opposite of that. They need more opportunities, these freer things. And the last point I want to make, and it picks up the summer-born children actually, it's about difference and individuality. You've got to know your children. You can't say just because they're in that cohort that this is what they need. You've got to really be able to flex culturally and demographically the curriculum around the child, which is what the EYFS said, the unique child. Create your curriculum, let the child lead, you create the curriculum around that. But you need to recognise their life experiences. And remember, those summer-born children have 25% less life experience. That's a hell of a lot. Okay, you need to recognise that. They're not the same as a child. A child just turning 4 is not the same as a child just turning 5. They're not the same. We can't give them the same, have the same expectations around them. And the evidence is, it's the expectations we have rather than the children. So, given that evidence base, this is what I'm now speaking on behalf of the Coalition, have looked at that evidence, and these are some key recommendations that they're going to be flagging as a result of that evidence base. They're going to really flag and push that the characteristics of effective teaching and learning, that pedagogic approach, and what makes an effective learner, those things like resilience, self-regulation, self-management, self-organisation, those are the things that really need to be foregrounded as critically important, because if children leave the foundation stage without that, they're in trouble. Okay? We are going to emphasise and continue to flag that the current prime areas are particularly crucial and time-sensitive. Dame Claire's Tickell and rationale for that stands with the recent evidence. But we're acknowledging that all areas of learning are interconnected and that you can't teach children in little boxes, that all the different areas underpin each other. And there is no evidence to support giving mathematics and literacy greater emphasis. They have emphasis, they're there, but we need to keep that broader framework for these young children, particularly pushing communication and language and PSED, and of course physical development, which is really important across the piece. If you want to find more information, I hope you'll go away with a copy of the document and look at it. It's on the website there to download. Greg has an announcement that says the key headlines from it. And if anybody wants to dialogue with Tony and me afterwards, there's our website. And we'd be quite happy to come, to present the work, to talk with you, to advocate, to politic, to have dialogue. That's what we need to do, is to talk about these things and keep going with them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. That's a fantastic overview of the research, and I just wanted to mention, because although all the logos were up there at the beginning, we haven't really sort of said a thank you to all the partners in the coalition. So all those logos are up there. As Chris said, a particular thank you to the Frobel Trust and Montessori Montessori St Nicholas for funding the review. And as Chris explained, and I just wanted to highlight, I'm not going to talk you through these, but in terms of the structure of the report, and it's an incredibly rich resource, which I hope you will all read every word of, but if you are skimming, you will see, as Chris explained, there are sort of 4 key principles that the Coalition is recommending. We've set out what we think the implications are for areas of learning, though again, possibly in very brief detail. And we've put in some other key messages which reinforce those principles. So those are all at the end of the report, just to help you find your way through it. I'm now very pleased to hand over to Vicky Bamsey to talk about the second piece of research I mentioned, the Practitioner survey. And it's very tantalising because we just have the headlines, but there's going to be so much more richness to follow. So.
Thank you, Beatrice. As Beatrice sort of said, this is very much going to be a 10-minute quick overview of our initial analysis of a coalition partner survey. And as Beatrice said, here just gives you an indication of the number of organisations that have been involved in this. So the survey has been sent out across the country, and we've had over 3,000 respondents. This has come from a background from the government's 2017 manifesto commitment to strengthen literacy and numeracy in the early years. In addition, the 2017 primary assessment consultation called for clearer early learning goals and an alignment with Key Stage 1. The social mobility agenda seeks to reduce the proportion of disadvantaged children not achieving across the early learning goals in communication, language and literacy. And in June 2018, the Department for Education announced they would be working on reforms to the early years foundation stage. So that's a little bit of the background of where this, why this survey was started. So the reforms include revision to the early learning goals with a focus on that language, literacy and mathematics, and to streamline the assessment guidance. So this survey includes responses from 3,270 respondents from across the country. It represents a variety of roles. They have a depth of experience of working within the EYFS, and they looked at what helps, what makes working within the EYFS more difficult, and what might change. So 97% of participants were those working in settings. The majority of practitioners were working directly with children, and 28% in addition to that were working in a managerial role. So it's important to consider that it is the practitioners that will be working directly with the children, and they're the ones who will be implementing any revisions to the EYFS and any associated curriculum and assessment guidance. So 72% of respondents have been working with children in the early years for more than 10 years. So there's a real breadth of experience there from participants. So the key headlines echo very much what's already been said within the literature review, which I found quite interesting. One of them is that, and I'm going to go on to explore these in a little more detail in a moment, but just to give you that overview, workload does remain a concern across the sector. But what has been emphasised by participants is just how well the current EYFS supports children's learning. So over 80% of respondents feel that the EYFS is supportive of children's development within the prime areas of learning. And 60% feel it's supported within the more specific areas of learning. The barriers towards closing the gap include funding, training, parental involvement and interprofessional working. But the EYFS is not seen as a tool by itself to improve social mobility. Many of the barriers to social mobility cited by respondents are those which sit outside of the direct influence of earlier settings, such as the home environment, and that a more holistic approach is needed when working with young children. So I'm just going to go into those in a little bit more detail. So first of all, focusing on decreasing the workload. As I said, workload was raised as a concern by participants, but the survey responses suggested that workload is not a direct result of the current EYFS, but that the excessive paperwork is being driven by an interpretation of inspection requirements in terms of evidencing children's progress and attainment. and pressure from above in terms of the settings management team. The amount of paperwork and a lack of time was also raised in relation to working with outside professionals, with a lack of comparable frameworks between organisations such as speech and language therapists and special educational needs. So how well does the EYFS meet children's needs? As I've already explored. If you look at this diagram here, you can see that over 60% of respondents overall stated that the EYFS supported children well or very well across all areas of development. But within the primary, had over 80% of respondents stated children's development was very well supported, and this drops to 60% within the specific areas. The areas of literacy and understanding of the world scored the least positive responses from the survey, as demonstrated in this graph, followed by maths. So reasons cited for why these specific areas are not so well supported by the EYFS included the home learning environment, practitioner knowledge and experience, interpretation of literacy, and the availability of time and resources. But looking at those barriers in a little bit more detail, when asked what barriers there were to reaching early learning goals and closing the gap between families who are advantaged and those who are more disadvantaged, comments related to, first of all, a lack of funding. So that related to parents' access to 2-year-old funding and eligibility for 30 hours of funding, but also the settings cost to deliver those funded hours and to work with outside agencies. If you think about resources and staffing, so time, resources, staff funding was cited as a barrier to closing the gap, and there was a tension between a need for experienced practitioners whilst offering low wages, and concerns over the time needed for behaviour management and the support of children with special educational needs. I think you can see that's starting to become a little theme that's running through this survey now. So then we come back to the home learning environment. So children's needs are based on their home learning experiences, and this in itself becomes a barrier to reaching children's potential. That, combined with the attitudes of parents who are not interested, then their child may not be receiving the support at home that they need. Communication and language skills, so children with poor listening and attention skills, as has been highlighted within the literature review, are missing the foundations they need for developing their future literacy skills. And lack of intervention, so the wait for access to other professionals is too long, with patchy implementation and insufficient funding. And finally, that lack of experienced and knowledgeable staff, as I've already mentioned, poorly qualified staff in the earliest settings, practitioners are not always dedicated enough or they are inexperienced, and there's a lack of staff knowledge and understanding. So we focus just in on that home learning environment, which seems to be a theme that's coming up throughout this survey. The influence on the children's home learning, the influence of the home learning environment on children's development has been referred to throughout the report. With participants of a lack of parental understanding, with speech and language difficulties, and a lack of funding and lack of access to earliest places. They are the key points of note. The EYFS statutory framework itself is not seen as a resource that is helpful in addressing these concerns, but as guidance for working with children once they are in the setting. The EYFS is seen as useful providing there is sufficient funding, access to those specialist support services I've already mentioned, to the resources, and having knowledgeable staff in place. And finally, if we look at improving social mobility is seen as a barrier for children to meet the early learning goals at the end of reception class. So the home learning environment and disadvantage are seen as key factors in closing the gap between advantaged and disadvantaged children, as already explored. However, the EYFS statutory framework itself, as I said, is not seen as a tool that is helpful in narrowing the gap. Many of the barriers currently sit outside of the direct influence of earlier settings. And these barriers include, as I've said, the lack of funding and resources, lack of access to specialist support, lack of experienced and qualified staff, which is linked to low pay, poor levels of speech and language, and of principal concern, the home learning environment and lack of parental engagement, as already explored. respondents do appear keen to work with parents to improve their understanding of child development and to improve the home learning environment, but the lack of funding resources and time restricts this. So to summarise, the Department for Education's keen objectives for reducing practitioner workload and improving outcomes for children has driven proposals for these EYFS reforms that we've been discussing, against the background for improving social mobility. And these reforms have focused on revising the early learning goals to make them clearer and to strengthen literacy and mathematics. Further support is also planned through updating development matters into curriculum guidance in the hope of making stronger links to the national curriculum, reducing workload and improving outcomes. But in light of the responses to this survey, it would suggest that these changes will not drive improvement for children's outcomes or social mobility, as it is not the EYFS document itself that drives this, but the home learning environment, funding and early years expertise. So when we consider reducing the workload of practitioners, a key aspect is the interpretation of inspection requirements. The current EYFS is seen as supportive of children's development across all areas of learning, with the prime areas acting as foundations to later learning. And the barriers to closing the gap are the funding, training and working with parents and interprofessional working. So it's important to take a holistic approach to working with young children, to consider children's development as interconnected across all areas of learning, both in the setting and at home, because as I've been echoing throughout this short presentation, the EYFS on its own does not drive children's outcomes or social mobility, and instead it is a combination of the home learning environment, resources and early years expertise. So very much this has been a snapshot of the responses we've had. There's 3,270 participants. We hope to go into this in a lot more detail over the forthcoming time, and I'll hand back to Beatrice and the panel.
Thank you very much, Vicky. That gives you some idea of the richness of data, and we can't give you an exact timescale of when we'll have the full report, because we're trying to balance our desire to do really full justice to those responses and quite how long we've got to feed things in usefully to the department. So we're kind of trying to strike a balance on that, but we will certainly be in touch with you all and letting everybody know about the next stages. So if I could invite the panel members to come up and join me. Sorry, and there you have the names of our panel. So I will ask each of the panel members to introduce themselves. And what we ask them to do is just have maybe up to 5 minutes to make a bit of comment about the report. And after that, we will open up the floor for you to comment, to ask questions of the panel or of the researchers, both Chris and Tony. Where's Tony? Tony, you're supposed to be sitting up here too, aren't you? Where's he gone? Lost Tony. Are you coming to join us on the panel? Yeah, come down now, boy. Sorry, I think you've lost me researchers. And obviously Vicky's also here, but we've run out of chairs, so at this point it may be a matter of responding from the audience. No, there's a chair here. I'm gonna sort of get out the way and leave the panel, and I'll let you sort of pass the baton amongst yourselves. So, yeah, okay, I shall get out of Michael's way and leave you to hear from the panel.
Sorry. Thank you, Beatrice. My name is Michael Freeston from the Early Years Alliance, Director of Quality Improvement. And as Beatrice has said, we're very keen to hear from you any comments you've had in terms of what you've heard today or any chance you've had to see early sight of the report. But I thought we just thought we'd take a few views from people who've been involved in the coalition. And I thought I'd spend my time just giving a bit more background about the genesis of the work about which you've just heard. I was one of those invited along with Stella, Susie from Pacey at the time, and Beatrice to a meeting with DFE colleague Susie, who's with us today, and Henna, to discuss some concerns that we had expressed about the proposed early learning goals. And they helpfully invited us to say, well, this is a process. If you feel as though there is any evidence or any materials information that you would like to put in front of the Minister when he or she, whoever it may be, next turns their mind to the consultation which we're due out in this autumn, then by all means do so, and we will ensure that that is made available. So the challenge to us was, right, what do we try and present? And it made us reflect back on government is always keen on evidence-based policy, so we need to do some work in terms of what the evidence now says. But also we reflected back on where we were 10 years ago with the introduction of the EYFS, that one of the successes about its implementation was how it took the sector with it, both in terms of the materials that were developed, the support that was given to practitioners, the involvement of the sector as the process was brought forward. And so that led to this notion of both the academic research, but also the views of the sector. And just a couple of comments that I would make on the work that's been. It's been a pleasure to be involved in the coalition. And when you get a chance to read the report in full, it is tremendous. Not only has it the research effectively served that purpose of presenting the evidence, I have every confidence that it will become seminal reading for anybody who has an interest in the early years, particularly those studying qualifications, because it provides that academic thread through which we're always saying that people need to have when they're working with the youngest children. And the other point is, and I think it's reflected here today in a very hot room, but also 3,500 people responded at a time when the sector faces a whole host of challenges in terms of funding, but also in terms of retention and recruitment. We were concerned that people would not engage with this rather more prosaic agenda in terms of the future of the earliest foundation stage, and the evidence has demonstrated that that isn't the case. People have really taken a very strong view about the earliest foundation stage. It's held in very high regard, and I think the message that has come throughout all of this is that it needs to be amended with care and only in light of the evidence that is available and taking the sector with it. Thank you.
Hello everybody, my name's Elaine. I'm currently very lucky to be teaching and I've gone back to my roots in reception after 3 years in year one. And today I was sort of thinking about what I wanted to come and speak to you about today, and as I was sitting in a sand pit with my shoes full of sand and sanding my hair, and you're looking around and it was my children's first day at school today, and as I'm, that relational aspect you were talking about earlier on, and doing a meaningful baseline of my children, and looking at those prime areas, those effective learning characteristics, and actually the foundations that my children need as they start their journey in school. It was really powerful to think about this research from today. And actually, I'm really proud to be part of this coalition, because I say I'm only a teacher, because, that's what I do, that's my trade, and I was a nursery nurse before. But this coming together as a coalition is really powerful. And the fact you've come out on a Monday night at 7 till 9 o'clock, and the fact, that this has really, the fact that we've united in this way, I think sends a very clear message to our policymakers that whether we're childminders or in day nurseries or reception teachers or year one teachers or head teachers or in children's centres, wherever we're working, we're extremely concerned about the direction of travel for our youngest children. And these children, they are our future. I'm not being cliched saying that. They are. And what happens while they're in our care and how we work with their parents, we know has a lot to do with how the rest of their life turns out. And when you look at the front cover of this, I think it's fantastic that we have Froebel and Montessori named on the front. Because actually we're talking about really current research, we're talking about the most research that's out there, but we're also still hanging on to those things that we know that matter, those things from those early years pioneers. And if anyone's got a chance, we don't really have, there was an amazing programme about Montessori's life on Radio 4, and I heard it the other day, I was listening to it, I should have had Stormzy on probably in the car for my son, but I had that on instead. And as this person was talking about Montessori's life, we were talking about the unique child. We were talking about effective learning characteristics. We were talking about closing the gap, deprived children and changing children's lives. So what we're talking about, we have new research, but this is nothing new. And I go back to the fact that, what is the case for changing the EYFS? We know there are things we need to improve, And so the timing of this review is critical. And my place on this coalition is that I run kind of like a Facebook group. I thought it was on my own many years ago. But there's a lot of people out there, and I do think a lot of the response to the practitioner survey was a lot of people sort of in our network. Because I get so many messages from people working, you know, right across the sector, and although I applaud Ofsted and DFE's, you know, tackle of workload, unfortunately this isn't the way to go about it. And I say that as a reception teacher who's going to be doing baseline testing. And we're hearing about the broad nature of development, and we're hearing about the danger of narrowing it, and yet that's what I'm being asked to do when I do this test that's in front of me. And actually, I'm afraid that completely changing the early learning goals, changing the EYFS, bringing in baseline, all of these things, that's not going to reduce my workload. And I say as a teacher of 20 years, and a teacher who's quite got good at managing their time, these things aren't about workload reduction. And I'm so heartened to hear about the importance of the prime areas, and I love the effective learning and teaching characteristics. And actually, just adding that to it is going to give us as teachers to feel empowered about not just the what that we're teaching, but the how we're teaching it too. And the talk about this relational aspect. If we haven't got those relationships, I don't think we really have got very much. And I've spent my past 3 years really influenced by Julie's amazing work in year one, working tirelessly in year one. And the challenge of year one is that I don't know how it's got skewed over the years, but those of you a bit long in the tooth like me, you know, we had continuing the learning journey, we had the Williams review, we had Julie's amazing work, all these things that are saying the way for young children, who as Jan will tell us aren't developmentally different because they're in reception year one, the ways to build on the foundations in year one. But we're now in a place where people in year one actually are having things pushed down onto them. So I think it's time, and this was really highlighted in the research that we've got here, about actually year one is a transitional year. We have Key Stage 1, we have EYFS. Now, job in year one is that balance and that move, and I love the hybrid approach. And I shouldn't go on Twitter, but I do, and I get so cross by this, you know, you're either this or you're that. You're not. Today, I did direct instruction. We made paper dolls. You know, it's not about the fact that I'm not teaching. So I think that's a really powerful term. And I think this evidence is about empowering our sector. And from the sheer number of our 45,000 members who contact me day and night, and I mean day and night, they're contacting me about their workload. And some of it is perceived in terms of Ofsted, you know, what we think Ofsted want. So there's, you know, a lot still of work to be done around that. But I say it as whether you're in a day nursery or a childminder, or you're in a school setting or in a pack-away, sometimes people are challenged over why they're doing what they're doing. So why are you working in this way? Or, you know, I want to start doing this, that and the other in your classroom. So for these practitioners, I think this is a gift. It's a gift to us to be able to stand up, and if we have to go and have those really difficult conversations, to have everything at our fingertips. Because we're all very busy people, and I wish I could say that I know a bit of academics that's out there, but I don't, and I haven't got time to search it. I wish I did, I wish I did, but this is kind of given it to us in one book. So in terms of those of us currently in the sector working every day at the chalk face or the coal face, this is a gift to us to stand up and to go back to what really matters. For those of our students who are coming through and, you know, going into this wonderful sector, it's a gift to them, because they're looking at what's the research, what's the evidence, and at a time, a really critical time, and I think no one would dispute that the EYFS does need reviewing, of course it does, but I think this is the Coalition's way of reaching out to the policymakers and saying, you know, talk to us. Within our coalition, within this room, the expertise we have, the knowledge we have. So I think that is what this is about. It's about saying to those policymakers, engage with us, listen to us, let's have a dialogue, because at the end of the day, whether you're sitting in an office in the DFE or whether you're me in the sand pit with shoes full of sand, Every single one of us is about one thing, and that is about giving every child the very, very best start. So thank you very much.
I'm not sure how I follow that, but I'm going to try it. My name's Rosalind from Pacey. One of the things that I would echo is the title of this, Getting It Right in the Foundation Years, okay? A review of the evidence. One of the things that we need to think about are any of the proposed changes that come about are informed by evidence and are not a top-down approach. So it doesn't become a tick box exercise for our children. Our children are individuals. And we need to listen to what practitioners are saying. We've heard about the over 3,000 people that have responded from every walk of life, not just from schools. We've had childminders, we've had the PVI sector. Every sector is equally important. And as we heard earlier, we'll do things slightly differently. But everybody has an invaluable point of view that we need to listen to. And we need to think about how do we support each other as well within the early years. How do we work together? How do we take the evidence, and how do we support and work for the good of the children and for the good of each other as well? And yes, we've talked about the fact that one of the changes was about workload. Changes per se are not going to alter workload. It's about what do we mean, how are we going to implement that, and how do we understand the children and the families and the settings that we're working with. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Carolyn Silberfeld and I'm Chair Director of the Early Childhood Studies Degrees Network. I'd just like to echo what the others have said, but it has been wonderful working with this coalition that may come from different perspectives, but actually we all have the children at the heart of it all. And it's how we work with children, how we understand children, how we can support their learning and development. We very much welcome the report's evidence and from the practitioner survey, which I find fascinating, about the benefits of a play-based curriculum using, you'll see the term in the book, a balanced or hybrid approach, which can effectively support all areas of learning and also children's development. For me and for us as an organisation, what the findings emphasise is the importance of those who are working with young children to be appropriately qualified. It's really important that they understand how to use an effective relational pedagogic approach. These are all words that are in the report, and you'll read it and you'll be able to see much more about what I'm talking about. If practitioners and professionals have a good knowledge and understanding, they can use this evidence and their judgment. We mustn't forget about practitioners and professionals' judgment, which is being eroded, I feel, by some of the changes that are being implemented. Because what we need to do is we need to help them to interpret the EYFS and DLGs confidently and competently, giving every child the opportunity to achieve their potential in a respectful, holistic and an enjoyable way. I know that this will have an impact, this report will have an impact on, for example, all the early childhood studies degrees, where there are 20,000 students at the moment who will be using this as good evidence to support learning development of the students who are then going to become those working with children. Thank you.
Am I too tall for the microphone, or can you still hear me? Hello, I'm Susie Owen. I'm from the Department for Education. I have responsibility for the EYFS and the EYFS reforms. Also have responsibility for the home learning environment, so it's great. We're very interested to see more from your practitioner survey about that. And thank you to Beatrice for inviting Henna and myself along today. I think Elaine might have said it, or Michael said, to see this full room on a Monday night, what is it now, 8:15 is a testament, and also the response to the survey testament to how passionately people feel about early years. Predominantly I'm here in listening mode, we're here in listening mode, so I'm not going to comment too much on the report now. We've thankfully got a meeting with the coalition partners next week?
Thursday.
This Thursday, even better, so 3 days away, where we'll have an opportunity to get into some more detail, to talk to the report's authors and understand more behind the views, but it's been really good to be here today. I thought I'd just mention quickly some of the timelines around what happens next from government perspective. So I'm going to pretend for the moment there's not a whole macro political situation going on at the moment. Okay? So bear with me with that. So ignoring that, the timelines are. So we, as Michael said, we'll be working with ministers over the coming weeks to finalise the consultation that we're due to launch later this autumn, likely late autumn. We're waiting to see the full findings from the NatSten pilot of the revised ELGs that were published a year ago, and that have been trialled in schools last year, and that will be published alongside or at a similar time to the consultation. So as Michael and Beatrice have said, we were really keen to work with the coalition to ensure that the views of the sector could be presented to ministers and could be taken into consideration for ministers to take those on board as they're making their final decisions. Just a few things from the survey, which, as I say, we're really keen to understand more about the more detailed findings as to when you have them. But the things that are coming up around workload and the home learning environment, I would absolutely agree that the EYFS does not solve our attainment gap at age 5. I think we all know that the drivers of children's outcomes are really, really broad, hence why we've got to focus on the home learning environment and the last Secretary of State brought in and we're continuing to work with. And in terms of workload, we've been working really closely with Early Years Alliance and with Ofsted and others around workload, because we know that also is there's not one simple thing that you can do to change. It's going to take a whole cultural change to change the way that the expectations that are put on individual practitioners in settings. And what was interesting from the survey work that EYA did was how much some of that is perceived, some of that is things that practitioners or managers put on the workforce themselves. So there's a lot of things we need to think about, the things we need to do to ensure that we are treating our practitioners and our reception teachers with trusting their professional judgment, not expecting huge amounts of evidence gathering, and really feeling that practitioners can say and be confident in what they do need to do, but also what they don't need to do. And so we'll continue to work with EYA and others across the sector along that work, because it's multifaceted. So I'm going to keep sitting down. I'll obviously take any questions and answer them if I can later, but mostly we're really glad to be here and to listen to the passionate debate in the room. So thank you.
Thank you. Can I just say one thing that I forgot? I meant to say right at the beginning, that what I have spoken about, I'm speaking also on behalf of SEFTI, who we spoke about what we would like to get across, and SEFTI also are very much part of our thoughts.
I haven't really got much add to what we've heard. My name's Tony Bertram, and I helped Chris do some of that work for the report. We work in a children's centre, we don't work in a university. We chose to move out of the university to be close to practice. And I think that's what I want to talk about, is the link between research and practice, because I hear what you say. My granny used to say to me that I didn't have much nous. Some of you will know the word nous. It's actually a Greek word. It means knowledge about what works on the street, street peddler. You should always tell me, get your nose out that book. You're all full of book learning, but you've got no nous. Okay? There are some other Greek words about knowledge that we need to talk about. One of them is phronesis. Phronesis is the knowledge that comes from reflective experience, the wisdom that comes from reflective experience. We've heard some of that today. Sophia, I've got a doctor of philosophy, philosophia. Sophia is knowledge that comes out of gurus and experts like that, Chris Pascal, and the stuff that we read. It's a sophisticated form of knowledge. Aristotle and Plato walking down the beach. That's Sophia, the love of knowledge, that kind of knowledge. Sophia and phronesis come together here, I think. But there's another kind of knowledge that the Greeks talk about, and that's Gnostic knowledge. And Gnostic knowledge is actually the knowledge that you have in your heart about what's right. I think all of those come together in early childhood. And to see a room like this, full of researchers and practitioners, people based on practice, really all, and it feels a little cultish group, this, you know, all and as you said, Sue, you know, I passed saying, I just think that's fantastic. I think it's very difficult if you're a civil servant in the department. Sorry, particularly if you're a civil servant in the early years sector. Just think, since 2008, how many ministers we had. You know, some of them have left for the Lib Dem. Some of them are part of the, Britannia Unchained, you know, all that higher economics and stuff. Really hard. But what really worries me, and is the elephant in the room for me, is actually that as we get not to see the difference between assessment, and I'm into the assessment, I think it's a really important part of how we develop the curriculum, not to see the difference between assessment and accountability, and to focus on accountability as an outcome, and to use children as the way that you're going to assess and account for investment, policy investment. I think that's very worrying, and particularly when you say with young children, we're going to look for a normative, universal, simple test that we can put all children through, and that's going to be our level of judgment. Whether you're talking about going to be a word count, or whether it's going to be, can you do fonts, or can you add up this, or can you do multiply tables, or whatever. No, it's much more rich and different than that. And however that might be at age 11, I say, at age 4, come on, we can't do that. We've got to look at this as a rich, and if you're talking about social mobility, so much will be going on, you can't do that without looking at poverty. You can't do something like 0 hours contracts, all the rest of it. It's that social contract.